I still remember the first time I saw him. It was the summer of '92, and the Texas sun was melting the asphalt on Route 281. Folks were cranky, tempers were short, and everyone swore they could smell the devil's breath on the breeze. I was a sheriff's deputy back then, fresh out of the academy, patrolling the long stretches of nothingness that made up our little corner of hill country. Sheriff Tom Hargrove was the kind of man who could silence a room with a look, and that summer he was more tense than usual. "This town's got history, kid," he told me once, sipping coffee blacker than midnight. "You keep your eyes open, ears sharper. There's things out here that don't fit in a report." I thought he was full of it, until the drifter came to town. It started with a call about a car stranded just past the railroad crossing. The engine was dead, they said, and the driver wouldn't stop staring down the tracks. Sheriff Hargrove and I pulled up, expecting a heat stroke case or someone too stubborn to call for a tow. The man stood by the tracks, tall and gaunt, wearing a tattered black duster despite the heat. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes. God, his eyes. They were the color of storm clouds, swirling like he carried a piece of the sky's fury inside him. He didn't flinch when we approached. "Evenin'," the sheriff said, hand resting lightly on his holster. "Car trouble?" The man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "Not mine," he said, voice smooth as velvet. "Train's late tonight, Sheriff. Real shame." I glanced at Hargrove, who tensed like he'd seen a ghost. "There's no train on this line anymore," he said, his voice low and steady. The drifter tilted his head as if listening for something we couldn't hear. "Oh, it's coming," he replied. "Always does. Best you not be around when it arrives." That night, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. Folks claimed they heard the old train whistle, distant and mournful, though no train had run that track in decades. By morning, the stranded car was gone, and so was the drifter. For weeks, life in town took on a strange rhythm. Livestock turned up dead, their bodies untouched, but their eyes wide open, like they'd seen something no earthly creature should. A few locals claimed they saw the drifter wandering the roads at night, humming a tune that didn't sit right with their ears. The sheriff became obsessed, poring over old maps and records, muttering about something he called the Phantom Line. He never explained it fully, just said it was a piece of history folks had tried to forget. The final encounter came late one October night. A frantic call came in from the old O'Neill farm, a family claiming they saw lights on the tracks and heard a train bearing down on them, but when they ran outside, there was nothing there. The sheriff and I sped out, headlights cutting through the blackness. We found the family huddled on their porch, pale as sheets, pointing toward the tracks. "He was there," the father whispered. "The drifter." He waved, and then what? I asked, my stomach knotting. The man pointed to the tracks. They disappeared. We walked the tracks, flashlights sweeping back and forth. That's when we saw them, footprints leading straight down the middle of the rails, stopping abruptly as if the drifter had stepped off the earth itself. And then we heard it, the whistle, low and haunting, growing louder, closer. The rails began to hum underfoot, vibrating with an energy that made my teeth ache. I turned to run, but Sheriff Hargrove stood his ground, his face set like stone. "Get back to the car, kid," he said, his voice cutting through the rising wail of the phantom train. "But go!" I ran. When the noise finally stopped, I crept back, heart pounding. The tracks were empty, as if nothing had ever been there. But the sheriff, he was gone. No sign of him, just his hat lying on the ground, brim bent and dusted with gravel. I searched for him for years, and so did others. But deep down I knew. Whatever that drifter was, whatever dark purpose he served, Sheriff Hargrove had stood against it. And he'd lost. Even now, when the air gets heavy and the nights stretch long, I swear I can hear that whistle, faint and far off, a warning carried on the wind. I retired last year, but I still keep my badge, a reminder of what I saw, and of the man who vanished into the night, taking the secrets of the Phantom Line with him. So if you're ever driving through hill country and you see a tall, pale man by the tracks, do yourself a favor, don't stop, because some trains are better left unseen. When you've been in law enforcement as long as I have, you learn that folks have all sorts of stories about the land. Some are harmless, tales of buried treasure or ghost lights. Others stick with you like a bad dream. This one, it's the kind of story that keeps you up at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering just how much we don't know about the world we live in. It was late October 1987 when I got the call. A rancher named Earl Whitaker reported strange noises coming from a well on his property, about 20 miles outside of Laredo. "Sounds like screaming," Earl said, his voice trembling. "Ain't no wind that makes a noise like this." I figured it was an animal, or maybe the wind playing tricks. I told Earl I'd come by in the morning, but he wasn't having it. "Sheriff, you don't understand," he insisted. "It's getting louder." By the time I pulled up to the Whitaker ranch, it was near midnight. Earl met me at the gate, flashlight in hand. He was a wiry man with a face like old leather, but tonight he looked spooked, his eyes darting toward the horizon like something might jump out of the shadows. "It's over there," he said, pointing toward the back pasture. The well was ancient, its stones cracked and moss-covered. Earl explained it had been dry for decades, but as we approached, I heard it, a faint, high-pitched wail, like a woman crying. My skin prickled. "You hear it, don't you?" Earl whispered. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just air moving through the cracks." Earl shook his head. "No, sir, that ain't no air." I leaned over the edge, shining my flashlight into the blackness. The beam didn't reach the bottom. The sound, however, grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just wailing, it was voices. Multiple voices, overlapping, pleading, screaming. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Who else knows about this?" "Just you," Earl said. "Didn't want folks thinking I'd lost my mind." I radioed my deputy, Carl, and told him to bring some rope and a stronger light. He grumbled about the late hour, but said he'd be there in 20 minutes. While we waited, Earl and I sat in silence, the wails rising and falling like waves. Then, just as Carl's headlights appeared in the distance, the sound stopped. Carl wasn't thrilled about lowering me into the well, but I wasn't about to let him do it either. I strapped on the harness, double-checked the knots, and gave him the signal to start lowering me down. The walls were damp and slick, the air heavy with the smell of wet stone and something sour, like rotting meat. About 20 feet down, my flashlight caught something etched into the stone. Symbols, crude and angular, like they'd been scratched in haste. I radioed up to Carl, describing what I saw, but his reply was static. "Carl?" I called. Nothing. The wails started again, louder this time, echoing up the well and vibrating through my chest. I tried to radio again, but it was useless. That's when I saw it. A hand. It reached out from the darkness below, pale and bony, with fingers too long and nails that scraped against the stone as it clawed its way upward. I screamed for Carl to pull me up, my voice bouncing off the narrow walls. The rope jerked, and I felt myself being yanked back toward the surface. But the hand didn't let go. Something grabbed my ankle, icy and strong. I kicked and thrashed, the flashlight tumbling from my grip and disappearing into the void. The wails were deafening now, the voices shrieking in languages I couldn't understand. With one last, desperate kick, I felt the grip loosen. The rope shot upward, and I emerged gasping into the night air. Earl was gone. Carl stared at me, pale as a ghost. "Sheriff," he whispered, pointing toward the house. I followed his gaze. Earl was there, standing in the doorway, but something was wrong. His eyes were black as coal, his mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong on a human face. "He's not Earl," I muttered, backing away. Earl, or whatever was wearing his skin, laughed, a deep guttural sound that rattled my bones. "The well isn't for mortals," it said, the voice layered, like multiple people speaking at once. "But you've seen it now. It will call you back." The next day the well was gone. The ground where it had stood was smooth, as if it had never existed. Earl's truck was still at the ranch, but he, and whatever had taken his place, was nowhere to be found. I quit drinking that year, thought maybe I was losing my grip. But every so often, especially on quiet nights, I hear those wails again, faint and distant, like they're calling me back. I keep a journal now, writing down every strange thing I've ever seen on the job. Not because I want answers. I've learned some questions are better left unanswered, but because I know I'm not the only one who's heard the voices in the dark. So if you're ever out in the Texas countryside and come across an old well, my advice is simple: leave it alone, because some things buried should stay that way. I've been in law enforcement for over 3 decades, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the land keeps its secrets. Out here in Texas, the wide open spaces can play tricks on a man's mind. But every so often, something comes along that isn't a trick, something you can't explain. This happened back in '96 in a little patch of nowhere between Fort Stockton and the Davis Mountains. Rancher named Harold Timmons called me late one night, his voice shaking so bad I could barely understand him. "They're back, Sheriff," he said. "The herd, they're back." Now, Harold was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghost stories or tall tales, but he'd been calling my office every few years with the same story. A herd of ghostly cattle that showed up on his property in the dead of night. I didn't buy it, not at first. But that night, something in Harold's voice made me grab my keys and drive out there. The Timmons Ranch was a sprawling expanse of dust and scrub, with a few skinny cows and an old barn that leaned hard to the left. When I pulled up, Harold was waiting on the porch, a rifle slung over his shoulder and a lantern in his hand. "They're in the south pasture," he said, his eyes darting nervously toward the horizon. "You'll see." I followed him out, the moon hanging low and bright in the sky. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that makes your skin itch. As we approached the pasture, I noticed the fence was broken in several places. The wood splintered like it had been hit by a freight train. And then I saw them. A herd of cattle, more than I could count, standing perfectly still in the moonlight. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and their bodies seemed to shimmer, half solid and half something else. Their heads turned in unison, all of them staring straight at us. "What in the hell?" I muttered, my hand instinctively reaching for my sidearm. "They're not real," Harold whispered, clutching his rifle tighter, "but they can hurt you just the same." As we stood there, the temperature dropped so fast my breath fogged in the air. The cattle began to move, their hooves silent against the ground. They circled us slowly, their glowing eyes unblinking. I tried to radio back to the station, but all I got was static. Harold muttered something under his breath, words I didn't recognize. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Old Comanche prayer," he said. "My granddaddy taught it to me. Said these things ain't natural, and you gotta respect their ground, or they'll take you with them." The cattle stopped circling, their heads snapping toward the far end of the pasture. That's when I saw it. A massive bull, easily twice the size of any normal animal. Its horns twisted like roots. Its eyes burned brighter than the others, and its body seemed to ripple, like smoke caught in a windless room. "That's their leader," Harold said, his voice shaking. "El Toro Maldito, the cursed bull." The bull lowered its head, pawing the ground as if ready to charge. Harold fired a shot into the air, but the sound seemed to vanish, swallowed by the night. "It's coming," Harold yelled. "Run!" We sprinted toward the fence, the bull's thunderous steps shaking the earth behind us. I glanced back once, and I swear it was right on my heels, its glowing eyes boring into me. We dove over the fence, landing hard in the dirt. When I turned around, the pasture was empty. No cattle, no bull, nothing but the broken fence and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Harold refused to stay on the ranch after that. He packed up and moved to El Paso, leaving the land to rot. I checked in on it from time to time, but nothing ever seemed out of place. Until a few years later, when another call came in. A new family had bought the property, and they'd seen the herd. Only this time, someone didn't make it out. I don't go near that land anymore. Some places aren't meant for us, and some things can't be fixed with a badge or a gun. So if you're ever driving through West Texas and you see a herd of cattle that don't look quite right, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Because some herds aren't meant to be rounded up, and some bulls don't belong to this world. Every sheriff in Texas has a few stories that don't sit right, the kind you can't put on paper or explain to your wife without her giving you that look. This one's mine. It happened in the summer of 1993, out near Terlingua, close to the Big Bend. If you've ever been out there, you know how empty the place feels. Just stretches of desert and sky, like God forgot about it. The call came in just after midnight. A trucker on Route 170 reported a convoy of old military vehicles heading toward town. No lights, no plates, and no drivers I could see, he said, just rolling along like ghosts. I figured it was a prank or maybe someone filming a movie without a permit. Still, I drove out to take a look. The road was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the last person alive on Earth. And then I saw them. The convoy came out of the dark like a memory, a line of old military trucks and jeeps, their paint chipped and faded. They looked like they'd been pulled out of a museum or a graveyard. I pulled my cruiser to the side of the road and hit the lights, stepping out with my hand on my holster. "Sheriff's Department," I called. "Stop your vehicles." They didn't stop. The trucks rolled past me, their engines purring low and steady. I shined my flashlight at the nearest one, and that's when I realized something was wrong. The driver's seat was empty. I climbed back into the cruiser and followed them, radioing dispatch. "This is Sheriff Holland. I've got a convoy of vehicles on Route 170 heading east. No drivers." Static. I tried again, but the radio just crackled. The convoy picked up speed, the trucks rattling like skeletons. I hit the gas to keep up, my cruiser struggling to match their pace. We barreled down the highway, the desert blurring around me. I don't know how long I chased them, 5 minutes, maybe 10, but then the lead truck suddenly veered off the road, heading straight into the desert. I hesitated. There's no reason to drive into that wasteland unless you're lost or crazy. But something about those trucks made me curious, or maybe stupid. I turned off the highway, my tires kicking up dust as I followed the convoy into the desert. The tracks led me to an old airfield, the kind they used during World War II. It was abandoned, the hangars half collapsed and the runway cracked with weeds. The trucks rolled to a stop in a neat line, their engines cutting out all at once. I parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of oil and something metallic. I peered into the first truck. It was empty, just as I'd thought. But on the dashboard was a photograph, faded and yellowed with age. It showed a group of soldiers standing in front of one of these very trucks. Their faces were young, smiling. But their eyes... Something about their eyes made my stomach turn. I moved to the next truck, then the next. Each one had a photograph, each one showing the same soldiers in different poses. And in every picture, their eyes seemed darker, emptier. A sudden noise made me spin around. A low grinding sound like metal being dragged across concrete. The lead truck's headlights flickered on, bathing the airfield in an eerie glow. Then the others followed, one by one, their engines rumbling to life. And that's when I saw them. The soldiers from the photographs were there, standing in the faint glow of the headlights. Their uniforms were tattered, their faces pale and gaunt, but it was their eyes that froze me in place, black and hollow, like voids that stretched into nothingness. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stared at me. I don't remember running back to my cruiser, but the next thing I knew, I was tearing down the highway at full speed, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. When I finally reached the station, I was too shaken to explain what had happened. I told my deputies it was a wild goose chase, that the trucks must have been stolen and abandoned, but I never filed a report. A week later, I drove back to the airfield, hoping to convince myself it was all a bad dream. But the tracks were gone, the ground smooth as if nothing had ever been there. I told myself to let it go, but late at night when the world is quiet, I still hear them, the low rumble of engines, the faint grind of tires on cracked asphalt. And I know they're out there, somewhere, rolling through the Texas desert, waiting for the next poor soul to cross their path. So if you're ever driving down Route 170 and you see a convoy of old military trucks, don't follow them. Don't try to be a hero, because some roads lead to places you don't come back from. If you've ever spent a summer night in the Texas Panhandle, you know the wind never truly stops. It hums through the mesquite and rattles the old windmills, a constant, restless presence. Most folks don't think much of it, but after what happened in the fall of '87, I can't hear the wind without looking over my shoulder. The call came from a ranch about 20 miles south of Dalhart. Widow named Clara Hughes said someone was skulking around her property at night. "He whistles, Sheriff," she said. Her voice was calm, but I could tell she was scared. Low and slow, like he's calling to something. I figured it was a drifter or some bored teenager, but Clara insisted it was no man. "He's been here 3 nights in a row, always around midnight, and my dogs won't go near him." Now, I didn't believe in ghost stories back then, but there was something about the way Clara spoke, like she didn't want to say too much, like saying it might make it worse. I drove out to her place that evening. Clara's ranch was isolated, even by Texas standards. No neighbors for miles, just acres of dry grass and a few scraggly trees. The kind of quiet that makes you realize how alone you really are. Clara met me on the porch, a rifle resting in the crook of her arm. "He'll come," she said. "He always does." I set up a chair in her front yard, close enough to hear if anyone came near. The hours crawled by, the only sounds the creak of the windmill and the occasional yip of a coyote. Around midnight, I started to think Clara had imagined the whole thing. And then I heard it, a low, haunting whistle, drifting on the wind. It wasn't a tune I recognized, just a slow, rising note, followed by a soft drop, like a question left unanswered. I stood up, my hand on my flashlight. "Clara, stay inside," I called. The whistle came again, closer this time. It wasn't coming from the road or the barn. It was coming from the open field. I stepped off the porch, shining my light across the yard. The beam swept over the grass, catching nothing but shadows. And then I saw him. He was standing just beyond the fence line, his figure barely visible in the moonlight. Tall and thin, with a wide-brimmed hat and long coat that flapped in the wind. "Hey!" I called, drawing my weapon. "This is the sheriff's department. You're trespassing." The figure didn't move. He just stood there, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. The whistle came again, and this time I realized it wasn't coming from his lips. It was coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The yard was empty, but the whistle was louder now, surrounding me, echoing in the stillness. When I turned back, the man was gone. Clara came out onto the porch, clutching her rifle. "Did you see him?" she asked. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. "That's how it starts," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll come closer tomorrow night. He always does." The next night, I brought reinforcements. Deputy Mike Parker and I set up camp on Clara's property, each of us armed to the teeth. At midnight, the whistle returned. It was fainter this time, like it was testing us, seeing how close it could come without being seen. We combed the property, our flashlights cutting through the dark. But no matter where we looked, the sound seemed to move, always just out of reach. And then Parker screamed. I found him near the barn, his flashlight lying in the dirt. He was staring at the ground, his face pale as a sheet. "Mike, what happened?" I asked, grabbing his shoulder. He pointed to the dirt, his hand trembling. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just dry grass and dust. But then I noticed the footprints. They were massive, far too large for a man, and they didn't look right. Long, clawed toes, like something out of a nightmare. That was the last night we stayed on Clara's property. The whistling stopped after that, but Clara said the dogs still wouldn't go near the field. She moved to Amarillo the following spring, and the ranch was abandoned. I went back once, years later, out of morbid curiosity. The house was gone, burned to the ground, and the land had been swallowed by weeds. But as I stood there, staring at the empty field, I heard it again. A low, haunting whistle, drifting on the wind. And I realized Clara had been right all along. Some things don't belong in this world, and some places aren't meant to be disturbed. If you ever find yourself in the Texas Panhandle on a quiet night, listen carefully. If you hear a whistle that doesn't belong, do yourself a favor. Don't look for the source, because whatever's making that sound, it's already looking for you. Every sheriff has a story they'd rather forget. Mine begins with a church bell ringing in a town that wasn't supposed to exist. It was late September 1995. I was driving back to Bracketville after checking on an old rancher who thought coyotes were stalking his cattle. The road was empty, the kind of desolation you only find in Texas, where the sky feels too big and the land stretches forever. That's when I heard it. A bell, clear and deep, echoing through the night. It didn't make sense. There wasn't a church for miles. I slowed the cruiser, rolling down my window. The bell rang again, and I felt it in my chest, like the sound was pulling at something inside me. I should have kept driving, but curiosity got the better of me, and I turned onto a dirt path leading toward the sound. The road wasn't on any map I'd seen, and the farther I drove, the stranger it felt. The trees seemed older, twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. The bell grew louder, each ring pulling me deeper into the dark. Finally, I saw it. A church, standing alone in a clearing. It looked ancient, the wood weathered and gray, the steeple leaning like it might collapse at any moment. The bell hung in the tower, swaying gently even though the air was still. I parked the cruiser and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The place didn't feel right. The air was too cold, too heavy, and the silence between the bell's tolls was suffocating. There were no signs of life, no cars, no lights, not even a path leading to the door. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small against the vast emptiness. The bell rang again, and this time the door creaked open. It wasn't like in the movies where the door swings wide with a dramatic slam. This was slower, deliberate, like someone, or something, was inviting me inside. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but then I saw it. A shadow moving inside, just beyond the doorway. "Sheriff's Department," I said, pulling my flashlight. "Anyone here?" No answer. I stepped inside, the door groaning shut behind me. The interior was worse than the outside. The pews were rotting, their wood splintered and warped. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. My flashlight beam caught a pulpit at the far end, draped in a tattered cloth. Behind it, the shadow moved again. Too fast, too fluid to be human. "Show yourself," I demanded, my hand on my holster. The shadow stopped, and then it laughed. Not a loud, maniacal laugh. This was soft, almost playful, like it was mocking me. The bell rang again, and this time the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating in my skull. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. Where it should have been was just a blank wall, the wood smooth and seamless. My breath hitched, panic rising in my chest. The shadow appeared again, closer this time. It didn't have a shape, not really, just a shifting mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. It whispered my name. Sheriff Holland. I froze. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it began to change, forming into something more human. A man stepped forward, his face pale and hollow. My blood ran cold. It was my father. My dad died when I was 14, a heart attack out in the field. I'd found him myself, his body cold and stiff under the Texas sun. But here he was, standing in front of me, looking exactly as he had that day. "Why didn't you save me?" he asked, his voice echoing in the empty church. I couldn't," I stammered. "You were already gone." He stepped closer, his eyes dark and accusing. "You didn't even try." I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The bell rang again, and the figure dissolved into the shadow, which surged toward me like a living thing. I don't remember how I got out. One minute I was inside that cursed church, and the next, I was lying on the ground outside, my cruiser parked where I'd left it. The church was gone, the clearing empty except for a few dead trees. I drove back to town as fast as I could, the sound of the bell still ringing in my ears. I tried to find the place again, but the road wasn't there. I even checked old maps, asked locals if they'd ever heard of a church out that way, but no one knew what I was talking about. The thing is, I've heard other stories since then, about people seeing their dead loved ones in places they shouldn't be, about sounds that lead you to places you're not meant to go. I don't know what I walked into that night, and I don't want to know. But if you're ever out in the Texas backcountry and you hear a bell ringing where no church should be, take my advice. Don't follow it. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. You don't wear a badge for long without seeing something that sticks with you, something you can't quite explain. For me, it was the Skinner's Crossing incident back in the summer of 1993. Skinner's Crossing isn't much, a crumbling bridge over a dried-up creek about 30 miles west of Fredericksburg. No houses nearby, no reason for anyone to be out there unless they were up to no good. That's why I was surprised when a call came in about a car abandoned on the bridge. Local rancher named Doug Morrow said it had been there all morning, engine running, headlights on, but no driver in sight. I rolled up just after dusk. Doug wasn't exaggerating. The car was smack in the middle of the bridge, a beat-up old Chevy, its engine sputtering like it was on its last leg. I parked my cruiser at the end of the bridge and approached on foot, flashlight in hand. The air felt wrong, too still, too quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of that dying engine. "Sheriff's Department," I called. "Anyone here?" No answer. I shone my light into the car. The driver's door was wide open, and the interior was a mess. Fast food wrappers, empty soda cans, a tattered jacket on the passenger seat. Then I noticed the blood. It wasn't much, just a smear on the steering wheel and a few drops on the asphalt. I radioed dispatch, letting them know I had a possible missing person. As I waited for a reply, I noticed something odd. There were footprints leading away from the car, but they stopped halfway across the bridge. Not like the person turned around or climbed over the railing, just stopped. I leaned over the edge, shining my flashlight into the dry creek bed below. Nothing but cracked earth and weeds. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but too deep, too unnatural to come from any animal I knew. It came from under the bridge. I drew my gun and stepped closer, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. But duty is duty, and I wasn't about to let fear get the better of me. "Who's there?" I demanded. The growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through the steel beams of the bridge. Then I saw the eyes. Two glowing points of light, like burning coals, staring up at me from the shadows. They didn't blink, didn't move, just watched me. "Step out where I can see you," I ordered, though my voice didn't carry the authority I hoped it would. The thing under the bridge didn't step out. Instead, it laughed, a low, wet chuckle that sent chills racing down my spine. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when the headlights of my cruiser flickered and died. The darkness was immediate, suffocating. I could barely see the outline of the car on the bridge, let alone whatever was under it. I reached for my radio, but it was dead, just static hissing in my ear. The laughter grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from all around me. And then it stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I turned in a slow circle, my gun raised, every shadow suddenly alive with the possibility of something terrible. That's when I felt it. Hot breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, firing blindly, the gunshots echoing like thunder in the empty night. The thing wasn't there. Instead, the laughter returned. But this time it was distant, fading, as if the thing was retreating. The headlights of the Chevy flickered back to life, casting a dim glow across the bridge. And that's when I saw it. The footprints that had stopped in the middle of the bridge were back, but they weren't alone. Beside them was another set, larger, clawed, inhuman. The tracks led off the bridge and into the night, disappearing into the Texas scrubland. I searched the area until sunrise, but I never found the driver. The car was towed, the blood tested, came back inconclusive. No match in any database. The official report lists it as an unsolved disappearance, but I know better. A few weeks later, I got a call from another rancher, this one farther down the creek. He'd found a body, or what was left of one. The coroner said it looked like an animal attack, but no animal I've ever heard of tears a man apart like that. I haven't been back to Skinner's Crossing since, and I don't plan to. But if you're ever in that part of Texas and you come across an empty car on a lonely bridge, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some things should stay under the bridge where they belong. Some places in Texas have a way of clinging to your soul. Widow's Hollow is one of them. It's an old stretch of land near the edge of the Palo Duro Canyon, the kind of place where shadows stretch long and the wind carries whispers. Folks around there have stories about Widow's Hollow, stories they tell with a nervous chuckle over a campfire. But me? I don't laugh about it, because I know what I saw. It was the summer of 1988. A farmer named Clem Parsons came into my office, wild-eyed and shaking. Clem was a solid man, the kind who didn't scare easy, but that day he looked like he'd seen the devil himself. "See, Sheriff," he stammered, gripping the brim of his hat like it might save him from whatever he'd fled. "There's something out in Widow's Hollow. Something wrong." I leaned back in my chair, already bracing for a tall tale. "What kind of something?" Clem swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "A woman. But she ain't no regular woman. She's floating. Just floating in the trees." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It never came. Widow's Hollow got its name back in the 1800s when a young woman, Abigail Carter, lost her husband in a cattle stampede. The story goes, she was so heartbroken she walked into the canyon one night and never came back. Some say she jumped. Others say she got lost and the coyotes found her. Either way, folks swear her ghost lingers in those woods, searching for her lost love. I'd always written it off as folklore, until that night. Clem refused to go back out there, so I drove out alone, the late evening sun dipping below the canyon's jagged edges. Widow's Hollow was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for a sound, any sound. I parked my cruiser and stepped into the woods, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and earth. At first, there was nothing. Just the crunch of my boots on dry leaves and the occasional rustle of wind in the branches. But then, as the sun disappeared completely, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was still, like the whole world was holding its breath. That's when I heard the humming, soft at first, like someone singing a lullaby just out of earshot. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. The humming didn't stop. It grew louder, clearer, until I could almost make out the melody. It was mournful, a tune that wrapped around my chest and squeezed. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches forming twisted arches above me. And then I saw her. She was standing, no, floating, a few feet above the ground, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, tangled like it hadn't been brushed in decades. She wore a tattered white dress, the hem swaying as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. "Ma'am," I said, my voice trembling despite myself. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when she turned around. Her face. God help me, her face was wrong. Her eyes were empty sockets, black holes that seemed to pull the light right out of the air. Her mouth twisted into a grin far too wide, the edges splitting her pale skin. She opened her mouth, and the humming turned into a piercing wail, a sound that burrowed into my skull and made my vision blur. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The wailing stopped as suddenly as it had started. I scrambled to my feet, but she was gone. I didn't waste any time getting back to my cruiser, my heart pounding like it was trying to break out of my chest. But as I reached the edge of the woods, I heard it again. The humming. It was closer this time, circling me, though I couldn't see a damn thing. I jumped into the cruiser and gunned it, the tires spitting gravel as I sped away from that cursed place. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, that awful grin seared into my memory. Clem left town not long after, said he couldn't bear to live so close to Widow's Hollow. I didn't blame him. I still get calls now and then. Hikers claiming they heard singing in the woods, campers saying they saw a woman in white floating among the trees. I always tell them the same thing. Don't go looking for her. Because if you find her, she'll never let you go. And that humming, once you hear it, it's already too late. There's an old saying in West Texas. The Pecos River doesn't give back what it takes. It's the kind of river that snakes through badlands and desert, shallow in some places, deep and dark in others. The kind of river that hides secrets. I learned that the hard way one October night in 1997. The call came in just after midnight. A truck driver heading up Highway 285 swore he saw a man carrying a lantern walking along the banks of the Pecos River. Normally, I'd chalk it up to a drunk or a drifter, but the driver was adamant. "Saw him clear as day," he said over the phone, his voice trembling. "But Sheriff, he wasn't..." Right. His face was all wrong. I sighed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "All right, I'll take a look." The river was about 20 miles out, a lonely stretch of road flanked by mesquite and scrub. By the time I got there, the moon was high, casting an eerie glow over the water. I parked by the old Pecos Bridge and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was cold, unusually so for a Texas night, and the river whispered softly in the dark. I walked down to the bank, shining my flashlight across the water. Nothing, just ripples and shadows. But then I saw it, a faint light bobbing in the distance. It was coming closer, moving steadily along the shoreline. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing across the water. The light paused for a moment, then resumed its steady approach. As it got closer, I could make out a figure holding the lantern, a tall man in an old-fashioned coat and wide-brimmed hat. His face was obscured by the shadows, but his gait was deliberate, like he knew exactly where he was going. "Sir, this is the sheriff's department," I called again, my hand instinctively resting on the grip of my revolver. "You need assistance?" The man didn't respond. He just kept walking, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the riverbank. I followed, my flashlight trained on him. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop," I said, more forcefully this time. He stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the soft lapping of the river against the shore. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. The beam of my flashlight caught his face, and my breath hitched. He didn't have one. Where his features should have been was a smooth, pale expanse, like wax melted over bone. His lantern flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving beneath the surface of his skin, shapes writhing, pressing outward like they were trying to escape. The man tilted his head, as if curious, and then he spoke. Not with a mouth, he didn't have one, but with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't be here." The words were low and hollow, like wind howling through a canyon. Before I could respond, he turned and stepped into the river. I rushed forward, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't even hesitate. The water swallowed him whole, lantern and all, the light fading into the depths. I stood there, panting, my flashlight dancing over the rippling surface. It was then I noticed the footprints. They were all around me, pressed deep into the mud. But they weren't mine. They were too large, too long, and they circled me, as if something, or someone, had been walking around me the entire time. I didn't waste another second. I bolted back to my cruiser, heart pounding, and peeled out of there, gravel spraying as I hit the road. Back at the station, I tried to write up my report, but how do you explain something like that? Faceless man carrying a lantern walked into a river and vanished? I kept it vague. Investigated report of suspicious activity, no evidence found. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. A week later, another call came in. This time, it was a pair of teenagers camping near the river. They swore they saw the lantern man, as folks started calling him. Said he circled their tent all night, the glow of his lantern casting shadows on the canvas. When they opened the tent to confront him, there was no one there. After that, the sightings became more frequent. Hikers, anglers, even a highway patrolman swore they'd seen him. Always the same. a lantern bobbing along the riverbank, a faceless figure watching, waiting. I stopped taking calls about the Pecos River. What was the point? Some nights, though, when I'm driving the back roads near the canyon, I catch a glimpse of a light in my rearview mirror, bobbing along the riverbank. I never stop, because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The Pecos River doesn't give back what it takes. And the Lantern Man, he's always looking for the next soul to join him. I've been a sheriff for over 20 years, and I've seen more than my fair share of strange things. But what happened one night in 2004, during the worst storm I've ever witnessed, is something I still can't explain. It was late August, the kind of heat that sits on your chest like a weight. A dry storm was brewing over the West Texas plains, and you could feel it in the air, thick and heavy. The sky had that bruised color, the kind that makes a man feel small and forgotten. I was on patrol near County Road 59, miles out from Pecos, when the first crack of thunder split the silence. I pulled over to check my radio, but before I could call it in, I saw something in the distance, a flicker of light. At first I thought it was lightning, but it didn't come from the sky. It was a steady, pulsing glow coming from the old barn at the edge of Fisher's Creek. The barn hadn't been used in years, its wood rotting and splintering. I got out of the car, gripping my flashlight like it might protect me from whatever the hell I was about to find. The wind was picking up, tossing dust into my face, and the air felt like it was vibrating with electricity. I started walking toward the barn, every step echoing in the vast emptiness. The glow was getting brighter now, and I could see the door creaking open, despite the storm. It didn't make any sense. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. But as I approached, I saw him. He was standing in the doorway, tall and thin, silhouetted against the light. His clothes were old-fashioned, too old-fashioned. A dark suit that seemed out of place in the heat, with a black tie hanging loosely around his neck. His face was obscured, hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me. The light flickered again, and for just a split second, I could see his face. It was pale, almost sickly, with sharp, jagged features. His eyes were wide open, but they didn't blink. His pupils were so black they seemed to pull in the light like two holes in his skull. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking in the wind. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, disappearing into the darkness of the barn. The door slammed shut behind him, and I heard something heavy shift inside. My instincts told me to leave, to get back in the car and drive as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't move. I took a step forward, and then another, my boots crunching on the dry ground. The door creaked open again, but this time it wasn't the man. It was something else, something larger. Out of the barn came a figure that was almost too big to comprehend, its shape warped and stretched. It seemed to tower over me, blocking out the light, its form shifting like smoke. The closer it got, the more the air around me crackled, as if the storm was funneling all its energy into this one place. I raised my flashlight, trying to focus on the figure, but it moved so fast, so erratically, that I couldn't keep up. It was like watching shadows move, bleeding into one another, never staying in one place long enough for me to understand what I was looking at. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't a voice I'd ever heard before. It was hollow, like a whisper carried on the wind, but somehow it felt like it was inside my head. "You shouldn't have come here." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words felt like they were suffocating me. Another voice, deeper, colder. "Now you'll never leave." Before I could react, the ground beneath my feet shook, and the storm intensified, lightning cracking the sky in all directions. The man, or whatever it was, moved faster than I could follow. He was in front of me now, his cold, empty eyes locked onto mine. Then, in one swift motion, he reached out and grabbed me by the arm. The chill of his touch burned through my jacket, freezing me to the core. I tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. The storm screamed louder, the wind tearing at my clothes, my hair whipping across my face. I felt like I was being pulled into the heart of the storm, into whatever dark force he commanded. And just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The man, the storm, the presence, Everything vanished in an instant. I was standing alone in the field, the barn just a silhouette against the storm clouds. The air was still again, unnervingly quiet. I stood there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I knew one thing for sure, that wasn't just a man. And whatever it wasn't gone. I didn't report what happened. I couldn't. Who would believe it? That night, I drove home, hands shaking on the wheel. Since then, I've been back to that barn several times. I've seen lights, heard whispers, felt the air crackling with that same energy. But I've never seen the man again. Some nights when the storm rolls in, I can feel him watching. I don't know what he wants, but I know I'm not the only one he's waiting for. And I'm sure as hell not going back out there again. It was a dry, suffocating summer night in 2003 when I first encountered the thing that haunted the old gas station off Highway 90. It had been abandoned for years, at least that's what we thought. I didn't believe the rumors. Not until that night. It was just a normal shift for me, making my usual rounds, checking on the highway, making sure the town was quiet. West Texas is a lonely place at night, where the wind whispers through the brush and the stars fill the sky like glitter on velvet. That's the kind of night it was, empty and still. I was about 30 miles outside of town when I noticed the old gas station looming in the distance. It had been closed for as long as I could remember, its pumps rusted and broken, the lights long since burnt out. The station didn't even have a name on it anymore, just a faded sign, the letters barely legible. Still, something made me pull over. Maybe it was the nagging feeling I got in the pit of my stomach, the same feeling you get when you're too far out to be comfortable. A feeling that someone, or something, was watching. I parked my patrol car at the edge of the lot and turned off the engine. The place was dead quiet. No cars, no lights, not even a flicker of movement. I took a breath, feeling the sweat starting to gather under my shirt. I got out of the car and walked toward the front door of the station. It was cracked open, just a sliver, like someone had left in a hurry. I figured I'd check it out, make sure there wasn't anything suspicious going on. Maybe squatters, maybe something else. I wasn't sure, but I wasn't about to ignore it either. As I approached, I noticed something strange. There was an old newspaper crumpled up and tossed near the door. It was dated May 14th, 1986. The date sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't say why. It was just a damn newspaper. I pushed the thought aside and stepped inside. The interior was musty, a thick layer of dust covering everything. The shelves were empty, the counter abandoned. The old register sat there, frozen in time, its display dark and lifeless. But it wasn't the station that unsettled me. It was the feeling that something was off. There was a low hum in the air, like static crackling just beyond the threshold of hearing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, near the bathroom door, was a figure standing in the shadows. It wasn't a man or a woman. It didn't have a shape, at least not one I could comprehend. It was like something was pressed against the walls of the room, something that didn't fit, like the air itself was being bent. I froze. It didn't move, but I could feel it. It was aware of me. I reached for my gun, but before I could pull it from the holster, a voice came from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was distorted, like it was coming from an old radio, warped and broken. I swallowed hard. My pulse was racing. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. I couldn't move. Then the figure took a step forward. Not a physical step, more like a shift, as if it was part of the air itself, sliding into the space where it didn't belong. And with it came a cold so deep, so bitter, it made my breath freeze in my chest. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It didn't have to. The hum in the air grew louder, and I felt something cold against my skin, like fingers brushing against my neck. The voice came again, this time clearer, sharper. "You were supposed to stay away." I wasn't sure what it was. I don't know if it was a ghost, a shadow, or something worse, but whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. I had to get out of there. My feet were still frozen in place, and I could feel my body shaking, but somehow I willed myself to move. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the wooden floor as I bolted out the door. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I made it to my patrol car, shaking all over, my hands slick on the wheel as I tore down the highway, away from that damn station. I didn't stop until I was back in town, and even then, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what happened. The next day, I went back to check on the station, thinking maybe I'd just imagined it, that maybe the heat and the isolation had gotten to me. But when I got there, it was exactly the same as before, empty, silent. Not a single sign of anyone or anything having been there. But I know what I saw. I don't know what that thing was or why it was waiting for me. But I'll tell you this, I haven't driven past that gas station since, and I've heard the stories about people who did go missing near that stretch of road. It's said that some things are meant to stay hidden, that some places should be left alone. And if you ever find yourself near Highway 90 in West Texas, don't stop at that old gas station, because whatever's waiting in the dark will make sure you don't leave. When you work as a sheriff in a place as remote as Pecos County, you learn to expect the unexpected. But there's one call I've never been able to shake from my mind, a call that still haunts my dreams. It happened in 2009, during a stretch of quiet weeks that made me think we were in the clear, like nothing could go wrong. That all changed when I got a call late one night. It was just after midnight when the dispatcher radioed me in. A truck had been found on Hollow Hill Road, abandoned, engine still running, lights flickering. There were no signs of an accident and no one in sight. Just a truck, a black Ford, left behind in the middle of nowhere. Hollow Hill Road had always been known for being eerie. There were rumors about that stretch of land. People said it was cursed, that strange things happened there. I'd heard the stories. Locals whispered about a truck that had disappeared out there decades ago, or the strange lights that could sometimes be seen dancing on the hill at night. But I didn't believe in ghost stories, not until that night. I arrived on scene about 15 minutes later. The road was narrow, winding, and barely lit by my patrol car's headlights. There was no moon in the sky, just the dark, oppressive weight of the night pressing down on everything. The truck was there, just like they said, its taillights glowing faintly in the distance. It was a strange sight, even from a distance. I pulled up behind the truck and turned off the engine. The silence out here was almost suffocating. No coyotes howling, no wind rustling through the brush. It was as if the world had just stopped. I stepped out of my car, flashlight in hand. The truck was an older model, black with a chrome grille. No license plates, just a smudge of dirt where they should have been. The driver's side door was open, but there was no sign of anyone. The truck's engine was still running, and the interior light flickered on and off like it was malfunctioning. I took a few cautious steps toward the vehicle, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. Something felt off, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I leaned inside the truck, but it was empty. No keys in the ignition. I checked the truck bed, empty. No sign of anything that would explain why it was left running in the middle of nowhere. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling noise. It came from the hill just beyond the truck, up in the direction of the trees. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, closer this time, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. My flashlight flicked toward the sound, but the beam barely cut through the blackness. Then, through the trees, I saw a figure. It was a man, walking toward me slowly, his movements jerky, like he was struggling to keep his balance. He was wearing a plaid shirt and denim jeans, clothes that looked about 20 years out of date. His face was pale, gaunt, his hair long and tangled. He didn't say anything, just walked toward me like he hadn't even noticed I was there. I called out to him. "Hey, are you all right?" He didn't answer. I stepped forward, my instincts telling me something was wrong, that I needed to stay alert. The man came closer, his eyes wide and unfocused like he was in a daze. I reached for my radio, planning to call for backup, but the radio crackled and died in my hand. That's when I noticed it. In the darkness behind him, There were more figures, shadows moving in the trees. A woman, a child, a couple more men, all walking toward me in the same slow, aimless manner. They were all dressed like they were from a different time. The woman had a faded dress that looked like it had been sewn in the 1950s. The child, no older than 6, had dirt smeared across her face, her eyes wide open and unblinking, and they all had that same vacant look in their eyes. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my voice steady as I ordered them to stop. But they didn't stop. They just kept coming. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. I reached for my gun, but my hands were shaking too much to get a firm grip. The figures were almost upon me now, the woman reaching out a skeletal hand, her fingers twitching. Just when I thought I was about to be swallowed by the darkness, I heard a truck engine roar to life behind me. The black Ford, still running, still waiting. I turned and ran toward it. I didn't look back as I jumped into the truck, slamming the door behind me. I jammed the truck into gear and floored it, tearing down the road, my headlights flashing over the figures, who were still standing on the hill, staring after me. The road seemed to stretch on forever as I drove faster than I ever had before, my mind racing. I didn't stop until I reached town. I reported the abandoned truck to dispatch, but when they sent someone out to investigate, it was gone. No trace of it, no sign of any figures on the hill. The only thing left behind was the faint smell of dirt and rot, lingering in the air like an old memory. And after that night, I never went back to Hollow Hill. I don't know who those people were or what they wanted. Maybe they were spirits, trapped in a place they could never leave, or maybe they were something else entirely. But one thing is for sure, I never saw the truck again, and I'm not sure I want to know what it was doing out there in the first place. All I know is this: if you ever find yourself on Hollow Hill Road, don't stop, because once you do, there's no guarantee you'll leave the same way you came.